Hi, good afternoon. I'm Keith Mellinger. I'm the Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Mary Washington. I'd like to welcome everybody back to COVID-19 in Context. We're in week 6 now of our 8-week course, and we're excited to have a terrific talk today by some of our faculty about the historical background of pandemics. So I'm happy to welcome 3 of our professors here. 2 are from the Department of Classics, Philosophy, and Religious Studies, Dr. Angela Pitts and Dr. Leanne Hotalon. And then towards the end, we're going to welcome Dr. Claudine Farrell, our chair for the Department of History and American Studies, to talk a little bit about some other historical aspects of pandemics. So exciting lineup today. A couple quick notes. First of all, I wanted to thank the chair of the Department of Music, Brooks Kirkendall, for providing us with some of the musical arrangements that you were listening to leading up to the start of the talk. Also, today we do not have the Q&A box working, so if you want to leave a question for the presenters, please enter it into the chat box, and my colleague Anand Rao is going to be monitoring the chat box there and assembling the questions for us for the Q&A a little later. So yes, just put everything in the chat box. And again, if you have technical issues, you can also enter that into the chat box at the bottom there, and we'll take a look at that and handle that as quickly as we can. So let's get started here. I'm happy to turn over the presentation to Dr. Angela Pitts, Professor of Classics in the Department of Classics, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. Dr. Pitts.
Thank you, Dr. Mellinger, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today. My name is Angela Pitts. I'm a professor of classics in the Department of Classics, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. And my area of specialty is ancient Greek literature, and I'm really delighted to be here today along with my wonderful colleagues, Professor Hotalon, a classical archaeologist, and Professor Farrell, a historian in the Department of History and American Studies. Next slide, please, Dr. Mellinger. As we have been learning in this course, humans have long transmitted infectious diseases across vast distances and geographic borders through commerce, travel, military expeditions, and so forth, as this map of how past diseases have migrated shows. Infectious diseases, they appear, they go dormant, and then they reappear years, decades, and even sometimes centuries later, in part due to microbial adaptation, in part due to environment, and in part due to human behavior, such as sanitation and travel. Next. David Heyman, the former executive director for communicable diseases at the World Health Organization and its current assistant director general for health, security, and environment, has pointed out in a recent essay that for any discussion of emerging infectious diseases, the past is prologue, meaning that historical epidemics provide helpful lenses through which to view the biological implications, the social, political, and economic repercussions, the direct and indirect vulnerabilities of communities and nation states, and the ethical issues relating to contemporary and future infectious outbreaks. To date, we've seen a number of wonderful presentations that give us a glimpse into epidemics of the past, particularly Professor Delancey's highly informative presentation on representations of the bubonic plague outbreak in Venetian art in the early modern period. Next slide, please. Among the historical epidemics that you see on this slide, I'm sorry, past slide. Previous slide, please, Dr. Mellinger. We'll be discussing 3 of them: an epidemic that struck classical Athens during wartime in 430 BCE, the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century CE Roman Empire, and the influenza epidemic of 1918. In the brief time we have, we will try to give you a sense of the historical context for these diseases, what is known about their origins and their epidemiologies, the mortality rates they inflicted, and some of the repercussions of these outbreaks. In the history of epidemics, next slide please, one disease has attracted the interest of physicians, scientists, historians, scholars, and the general public. as the small sampling of headlines in journal titles on this slide shows. It was not the most consequential disease in terms of its mortality and international repercussions. Next slide. However, its description by the 5th century historian Thucydides, a statue of whom you see here on the left, has made it one of the most famous passages in classical literature and in the history of medicine. Next. At the height of its regional power and influence in the 5th century BCE, Athens went to war with Sparta, a rival Greek city. The bloody civil war between Athens and Sparta, whose locations you see displayed on this Google Earth map, would prove devastating to Athens' democracy and fatal to its aspirations to empire. Next. In the summer of 430 BCE, the Spartan army invaded the rural communities surrounding Athens, ravaging deserted agricultural fields, orchards, and homes. Refugees from these rural communities abandoned their intergenerational family farms to take up residence inside the city walls, a reconstruction of which is displayed on the left. These walls, as you see on the right, surrounded the city of Athens and led down to its port city, the Piraeus, where the city's powerful navy could be accessed. Pericles, Athens' foremost statesman and general, rationalized that the Athenian navy could obtain via trade sufficient food for the city's overpopulated residents to outlast any Spartan siege. But the influx of so many refugees resulted in critical overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. Most refugees had no proper shelter and were living in temporary shelters that were stifling in the hot season. The refugee crisis no doubt contributed significantly to the rapid rise of the epidemic. Next slide, please. It is worth noting that due to the present epidemic, cramped conditions and limited access to running water in the Moria camp on the Greek island of Lesbos are placing already vulnerable Syrian refugees and local residents at greater risk, to such an extent that many refugees are being moved to the mainland to relieve overcrowding. Here you see a photo courtesy of the news agency Al Jazeera showing Syrian refugees entering, once again, Athens' port city, the Piraeus. Next. But back to classical Athens. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's great. In this state of siege, a devastating epidemic swept through the city. Thucydides reports that the epidemic originated in what is now sub-Saharan Africa, passed through Egypt and Libya, and spread through much of the Persian Empire. It infected the population of the Isle of Lemnos in the North Aegean Sea, as you see registered on this map, before making its way to the Piraeus and then Athens itself, from which it spread elsewhere in Greece and in other areas of the Mediterranean. Next slide, please. On the basis of the symptoms described by Thucydides, who contracted the disease and survived, many historians, physicians, and epidemiologists have attempted to determine the exact pathogen or pathogens that caused the epidemic, and a number of candidates have been considered, such as typhoid fever, typhus, bubonic and pneumonic plague, smallpox, and anthrax, and a disease that no longer exists or is no longer recognizable. This table lists the proposed diseases and the evidentiary basis for these proposals. Thucydides' account, however, while invaluable, has proved insufficient to make a certain diagnosis or to determine a certain clinical reality, and it's difficult to find paleopathological evidence of infectious diseases. Next slide, please. However, during construction for a new metropolitan railway in Athens in 1994, archaeologists found skeletal remains in 2 communal graves that appear to have been rushed burial sites of plague victims in the Athenian cemetery of the Kerameikos. The remains of at least 89 human skeletons were found in them at successive burial levels, at least 10 belonging to children. A sketch of one of these communal graves on the left shows that the deceased were buried in disorderly fashion, some in outstretched positions and some in positions determined by the size and shape of the pit, a photo of which you see on the right. Corpses in the lower levels were positioned with more distance between each other and more regularity, while the upper layers contained less distance between each body and no soil between them. Next. Here you see a map of the excavated cemetery with the two communal grave pits just to the left of the center, identified as number 1. Next. While grave goods such as vases typically are found at the site of burials during this period, the grave goods that were scattered among the dead were remarkably fewer than was customary. This slide shows 2 of the 30 small vases scattered among the bodies in the lower levels of the pit, most of which date to about 430 BCE, right at the time of the plague. While the remains of 89 bodies were found, archaeologists have suggested that a more extensive burial site interring perhaps as many as 150 bodies has been destroyed in the last 2 centuries by soil disturbance. Given the number of the deceased, the hasty manner of the burials, and the dating of the grave goods, there is a consensus that this grave constitutes a site of mass burial victims of the epidemic. Next slide, please. Microbiological analysis of the dental pulp from 3 intact teeth randomly collected from the mass burial sites may have yielded DNA residues of Salmonella enterica serovar typhi, the bacterium responsible for typhoid fever. I say may have yielded because this study has been contested. While skeletal material does not preserve DNA evidence of many diseases, dental pulp, the highly vascularized tissue in the center of the tooth displayed on this slide, does and is often used by paleopathologists to study the disease. Next. Facial reconstruction of the victims, of one of the victims, an 11-year-old girl named Myrtis, researchers named her Myrtis, was obtained through a high-resolution 3D scanner. Her cranial skeleton you see on the right and her reconstruction on the left. Next slide, please. A video featuring an animation of Myrtis was recently published by the UN, in which she calls on all of us to listen to scientific experts, respect hygiene rules, take special care of our loved ones. We'll be putting up a link to that video so that you can enjoy it after the lecture. Next. The symptoms that Thucydides reports listed here sound rather miserable. They include a rapid onset, a high fever, red eyes, sneezing, raw throat, halitosis, and then things get more serious with vomiting and dry heaving, blisters and sores appearing on the body, and a thirst of such intensity, Thucydides reports, that people threw themselves into wells for relief. Sleeplessness and restlessness were among the symptoms, and many died after 7 or 8 days. Those who survived the 7-day mark often died from severe diarrhea. Those who survived the disease developed immunity, but often lost extremities, vision, and memory. Next. The epidemic caused social breakdown too, and this is perhaps Thucydides' larger concern. Indifference to morals, lawlessness, self-indulgence, disregarding customary funerary rites, scapegoating, rising anger at public officials, and a lack of moral resolve are the things he reports. Given the profound religious significance given to funerary rites in Athens, disruption of this sacred dimension of honoring the deceased struck Thucydides quite forcibly. As this recent Al Jazeera article that you see displayed on the left shows, we too, in the area of COVID, are struggling with similar concerns. We don't know for sure how many people died from the disease, nor how many survived. Thucydides says that the bodies of the deceased lay on top of each other, that fatally sick people crawled through the streets, and that the shrines and temples of the gods were full of bodies. Some historians have estimated that the disease claimed between 25 and 33% of the Athenian population. Next slide. We don't know for sure where else it spread, but there are a few small clues. Thucydides mentions that the Athenian navy brought the epidemic with them to the siege of Potidæa, registered on this map in 430 and 429, where both Socrates and Thucydides himself were stationed. Next. Another later historian claims that a plague struck Athenian soldiers as they were besieging Syracuse in Sicily, displayed on this map, in 413 BCE, and that another epidemic occurred in Sicily in 398 BCE. It is certainly possible that these were expressions of the same epidemic. Next. Thucydides claims that the effects of the epidemic were felt for decades. The Athenian leader Pericles died of the epidemic in 429, and in that political vacuum, a number of extremists, opportunists, and demagogues were able to rise up and dominate the political landscape. The epidemic significantly contributed to Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War in 404 and again in 386 BCE. As the chain of repercussions resulting from the epidemic in wartime, that is depopulation, loss of leadership, economic hardship, social disintegration, and growing political divide, seriously strained Athens' resources. According to Thucydides, nothing did more than the epidemic to exhaust the Athenians or cripple their power. And now I turn it over to Professor Hotelin.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Professor Pitts. We now turn to the second historic epidemic on the timeline, the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century AD. Next slide. The Antonine Plague was named after the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. You see a portrait of him here on horseback. Marcus Aurelius reigned between 161 and 180 AD, and he is known as the last of Rome's 5 good emperors. Marcus Aurelius loved and pursued philosophy his whole life, and his notes contemplating the Stoic life were later published as the Meditations, which still makes encouraging reading today. Marcus Aurelius could have ruled alone, but he honored the plan for succession laid out by his predecessors and insisted that the Roman Senate confirm Lucius Aurelius Verus as his co-ruler. This was the first time that Rome had co-emperors, and by all reports, they worked very well together. You see here an image of the 2 emperors on a coin, clasping hands in agreement. Lucius Verus died young, but he is important to the story of the Antonine Plague because it was his soldiers who spread the plague upon their return to Rome from campaigns in the east. Marcus Aurelius passed the throne to his son Commodus. If you have seen the movie Gladiator, then you have met both Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who died near the start of the film, and his son Commodus. While the film is far from historically accurate, its portrayal of Commodus as less than desirable does match the opinion of ancient and modern historians. Commodus is part of our story here because the Antonine Plague had a significant recurrence during his reign in 189. Next slide, please. Let us now take a look at the origin and spread of the Antonine Plague. On our map of the Roman Empire, you see arrow number 1 in the east, pointing to Seleucia in Mesopotamia. Ancient sources point to that city as the spot where the plague originated and said that it was the fate of Lucius Verus to seem to bring a pestilence with him to whatever provinces he traversed on his return, and finally even to Rome, number 2 on the map. As the soldiers returned in 166, went on leave, and moved to new posts, they continued to spread the plague in Italy, northward to Gaul and Germany, and throughout the empire. The third arrow on the map points to the city of Aquileia, at the very northeast corner of Italy, where the Roman legions had their winter quarters. Each legion kept its revered military standard, or eagle, in these winter quarters, and the name Aquileia itself means the place of the eagles. As an aside, given that our mascot is an eagle, I think that Aquileia, the place of the eagles, should be the Latin nickname for the University of Mary Washington. A significant outbreak of the Antonine Plague occurred in Aquileia in 169, and the premature death of Lucius Verus at the age of 38 on his return to Rome from Aquileia in that year was likely due to the outbreak. Marcus Aurelius spent the remainder of his reign at war against the Marcomanni, a Germanic people that had crossed the Danube frontier into Roman territory. Marcus Aurelius died, probably of the Antonine Plague, at the age of 58 on the Danube frontier, the fourth arrow on the map. Next slide, please. But was Seleucia in Mesopotamia the ultimate source of the Antonine Plague? Modern scholars have noted that around this time, from 151 to 185, there were several outbreaks of a pestilence in China and have connected those outbreaks to the Antonine Plague. This map shows the Han Dynasty Empire, and the blue arrow points to where a Roman embassy in 166 visited the Han Dynasty court in Jiaozi, northern Vietnam. We do not have a description of what sickness was recurring in China at the time, and certainly a visit in 166 would have been too late for the Roman embassy to have returned and started to spread the disease in the West. But it does seem possible that the disease was the same as that of the Antonine Plague, and that it may have started in Central Asia, in the general area where the Kushan Empire is marked on the map, and then spread both east and west along the Silk Road trade routes that loosely connected ancient Rome with China. Next slide. The Antonine Plague did not abruptly end with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180, but continued into the reign of his son Commodus. There was an especially significant outbreak in 189. The ancient historian Dio Cassius witnessed this resurgence and wrote that at its height, 2,000 people per day died in Rome alone. On this slide, I identify the Antonine Plague as smallpox, and shortly I will go over the symptoms that allow this identification. Here, however, I want to emphasize that while we can assign a limit of 189 and somewhat after to the Antonine Plague and its recurrence, smallpox itself would continue to crop up in Europe and around the world again and again. It was accidentally introduced to the New World by Spain in 1520. The drawing on the slide, taken from a 16th century manuscript, shows Aztecs in Mexico suffering from smallpox. In 1796, Edward Jenner acted on the observation that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox seemed immune to smallpox. He inoculated various subjects with material from cowpox blisters, and after exposing them to smallpox, he determined that they had acquired immunity through the vaccination. In 1967, the World Health Organization began an intensive effort to vaccinate against smallpox, and in 1980, the 33rd World Health Assembly officially declared the disease eradicated, a triumph of modern medicine and global cooperation. We are reminded regularly in news reports today that a vaccine against COVID-19 is our best hope for a return to normality. Next slide. Let us turn now to the evidence that the Antonine Plague was smallpox. The Antonine Plague is also known as the Plague of Galen, after a Greek physician in the Roman world who both witnessed the plague and left detailed descriptions of its symptoms. Galen was the physician of his time, and he left extensive medical writings, many of which survive today. If you visit the apothecary of Revolutionary War General Hugh Mercer in downtown Fredericksburg, this slide shows the interior of the apothecary, you will see medicine as Galen himself practiced it 1,600 years earlier, right down to one of Galen's favorite treatments, the letting of blood. Galen described the symptoms of the Antonine Plague as follows. The patient had a rash that covered the whole body. Sometimes the rash was black. It typically had ulcerations and scabs that left scars, the infamous pockmarks associated with smallpox. Modern researchers have used this distinctive rash to assign the diagnosis of smallpox to the Antonine Plague. Other symptoms included fever, black diarrhea, upset stomach, vomiting, foul breath, and a cough which produced blood. Next slide. The mortality rate is hotly debated, with figures ranging from 1% to 50% of the Roman population. The most compelling argument assigns a rate of 7 to 10% based on the mortality of later, better recorded outbreaks of smallpox. This figure was assigned only to deaths between 165 and 181, so settling on its higher end, 10%, helps take into account deaths from the connected outbreak in 189. Even this very conservative estimate, however, still means that about 5 million people died. 10% mortality led to diminished manpower, a diminished economy, or even a diminished military. Our evidence is uneven across the empire, but there appears to have been a significant reduction in building in Italy, the years during and after the Antonine Plague. And papyri from Egypt indicate the lowering of rents for farmland in the increase of wages for farm workers, both of which have been taken to mean that fewer people were available to rent and especially to work the land. We read in ancient sources that after the plague began, Marcus Aurelius had to recruit soldiers from the ranks of slaves, gladiators, bandits, and even Germans in order to continue his efforts against the Marcomanni. This suggests a manpower shortage that is confirmed by surviving records of the diplomas issued to veterans upon their retirement. There is a sharp drop in the number of diplomas issued in the years after the plague. The column of Marcus Aurelius, seen here on this slide, illustrates the campaigns during this period against the Marcomanni and other Germanic groups. Modern historians debate the question of how much this diminished manpower in the building industries, in agriculture, and in the army contributed to the eventual decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Certainly, the diminished manpower was a blow to Rome's prosperity and power, but it was a blow from which Rome could have recovered. The real answer lies in that it was one blow among many. The attacks on frontiers did not cease. The climate was undergoing a change, and the emperors were not always good ones. Finally, the Antonine Plague also affected religion. Roman state religion reacted as was customary, with ritual prayers and sacrifices designed to appease the gods and to soothe the population. It has been suggested by modern scholars, however, that the plague encouraged the growth of Christianity. The rationale is that Christianity required its adherents to do good unto others, and that not only their service to others during the plague, but also Christianity's promise of life after death attracted new followers. Critics of this suggestion question whether the number of Christians at the time would have been enough to make a missionary difference. Next slide. Two takeaways come to mind in relation to our current experience with COVID-19. First, although the Romans certainly experienced a diminished economy and effects on their life and welfare, they could have recovered from those setbacks. And as earlier talks have shown, we know more about economic factors and how to manipulate them than the Romans did. Second, smallpox was a global scourge until a vaccine and global cooperation eradicated it. Next slide, please. Next, we turn to Professor Farrell and the 1918 influenza.
Thank you, Leanne, and I think I am going to get the screen here. So this is going to be mine. So share. So let's see, start my video. I think this goes. So welcome everybody. I am the chair of the history department, and one of my fields is American disasters. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today, if I'm making sure that I can see myself, yes, okay, so I am talking, is some of the similarities between what happened in 1918 and what happened now just slightly over a century later. And what you see on the left here is the dominant event in 1918, which was World War I. And what you see on the right now is kind of the dominant competing event for us, or if you want to call it an event, the concern about the American economy, the concern about a global connected economy. And then on top of that, you have the social justice movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, where people are making decisions at all times about what should we give priority to. Well, in World War I, it was fairly easy. It was World War I. And the influenza epidemic that hit the United States and the rest of the world was generally tied, at least in the warring nations, to sacrifices that had to be made in the war. Now, most people still today call it the Spanish influenza. And it was called that by people at the time, although some people called it the Russian influenza and the Chinese influenza and various things like that, because Spain was not in World War I. It was a neutral. And as a result, it was not censoring information, and information, particularly when the king was struck by influenza, got out. And so this was the source of it for a lot of people. Some people speculate that the flu actually began in Eastern France. Others speculate China, they speculate New York, they speculate Massachusetts, but probably the dominant place that is still being asserted in the literature is Haskell County, Kansas, where a physician reported some very, very unusual, extreme, virulent cases of what he thought might be the flu, but wasn't sure, in early 1918. What we do know is that in the later part of 1918, Camp Funston, one of the many, many camps that were established throughout the United States to train soldiers, and they were 40, 50, 60,000 men here in about 2,000 acres. And Camp Funston, Fort Riley now, this is not for Camp Funston, but you get an idea of the potential number of young men, often without immunity, coming from all parts of the country, meeting up in close contact, training, living, eating. And very quickly you ran into this problem, which is this fairly famous picture from Camp Funston. Instead of a handful of soldiers showing up, hundreds would show up, thousands eventually would die. Because what you have, as this picture indicates, is an effort to combine dealing with the epidemic, which they finally determined was probably the flu, although it was often too mild or too severe to fit the definitions. But you still had to fight a war, and you still had to get men overseas. And then when the war was over, you had to return them. And as these scenes indicate, these ships were basically, sources of the flu. One historian has called them floating coffins. There were efforts to stop the spread, get men off who were sick, but often the men that went overseas carried the flu with them, spread them to troops that had not been infected, spread them to civilians, one of which was my mother's mother, who died of the flu in 1918. As this newspaper obituary suggests, these two young men, Chicago men who have died for their country, and if you look, they died at Camp Funston. They never made it overseas. One young man died of pneumonia, the other died of pneumonia and meningitis, both of which were secondary infections that actually killed more people than the flu, which weakened them, actually did. And you'll see from this photograph from the newspaper, this woman, one of the leaders of the Settlement House movement, was campaigning to raise money, Liberty bonds, so that way the country could support the war. She got sick, she kept campaigning, she died, but she died in service to her country. She died in service of the war. And as you can imagine, when the war was over in November 1918, which actually was the peak, as I'll show you, of the really killer second wave in the United States, people were hardly avoiding crowds, which is what they were encouraged to do. They didn't use the term social distancing, but they were trying to avoid the crowds until then, and then were celebrating, and cases spiked after this in many areas of the country. And areas that had reduced some of their restrictions had to reimpose them as a result of the spiking cases. This graph shows you the killing of the 1918 flu in the United States as best we know. But one thing to keep in mind, the fourth bar down, World War I, most historians say perhaps as many as 60,000 of those died as a result of the flu and the resulting pneumonia. So the killing in the United States was much greater, apparently, than what this indicates. Around the world, estimates are as high as 100 million, as low, if you want to call it that, is 20 million. This graph is very simple, but it shows you what was going on. There was an early mild case of the flu in the early part of 1918, which was pretty close to what the flu normally was. The flu didn't hit every year, but when it did hit, it was reasonably mild. In later 1918, in about a 10-week period, the great majority of American deaths occurred. So it was very much a killing time. And then the flu reappeared in 1919. In some cases, in some localities, it was mainly in 1919. And just to give you an example, when the troops were returning to New Zealand, New Zealand's flu deaths was mainly in late 1918 into 1919. Australia was mainly 1919. So it did vary across the world. But this chart shows you what I mean about the slight rise in the early part of 1918 and then the great rise in the latter part of 1918, comparing the previous few years with 1918. And this comment that it seemed that all the city was dying certainly applied to some cities, probably most notably Philadelphia. This chart shows you what was really striking and frightening for a lot of people and devastating for the population. The broken line shows the U-shaped that the flu generally has, where it's the very young and the very old that are most affected and who are the main victims. What happened in 1918 was a W shape, where the victims were in large numbers, men and women, but in the United States, mostly men, or not mostly, but more men than women, in the 20s and 30s. These are the healthy people. These were the strong people. These were the people who were supposed to resist. And these are the ones that kind of made the situation so frightening for so many people. This shows what's called a period life expectancy, and you'll notice the big drop in 1918. And this is a projection based on if that rate of deaths had continued throughout the time period, that people's life expectancy would have dropped a good 10 years. And you will see this same pattern in places like England and in Wales and Norway. Even at the time, people realized that more Americans were dying of the flu than were dying of the war. The greatest American military influence, close to 2 million men, came in the latter part of 1918. And these are some of the symptoms, and you might want to compare them to what Professor Pitts and Professor Tellen have told you about previous, much earlier ones. You see some of the symptoms here are very typical of the flu. You get a fever, you're tired, you have headaches, you have some trouble breathing, whatever. But this was extreme. Now, it was either very mild, and most people did recover, about maybe a 2.5% fatality rate. But what was so striking and frightening to many of the doctors was when they did autopsies and they opened up the chest cavity and the lungs were red and blue. The person had died of lack of oxygen, died in his or her own fluids. And it was a frightening, frightening death. It often came very quickly. And by quickly, I mean not only time-wise, but people often felt perfectly fine in the morning. And then they were dead that evening. The symptoms came on that quickly and that horrendously. And as the bottom list suggests, there were evidence, as you might pick up today with COVID-19, of some mental or emotional disruptions. And that certainly was the case allegedly with Woodrow Wilson. And the link to pneumonia is not surprising, considering that at this time they had no antibiotics, that you might apply to some diseases, and also no antiviral virals that you would apply to others. So when people got really this sick, there was limits on what they could do. In the next 10, 20, 30 years, the options increased significantly. So what people wound up doing was relying on non-pharmaceutical intervention, what we call social distancing, face masks. And as you see by these circles going across the United States, as the flu traveled westward, I guess you could say, on the railroads, not airplanes, obviously, on the railroads, and in some cases the roads, cities toward the west tended to have more time to prepare, and they often took action more preventively. And this graph shows you in the green Philadelphia. Philadelphia decided to go ahead with a parade to raise money for the war on September 28th, and the big spike you see is what came afterwards. St. Louis, one of the cities that handled things, I guess you could say, better, took action very, very early. There was a public health service, but most of the action you see was not even taken by states. It was taken by localities, and mayors and public health directors were the ones that made a lot of these decisions, often with a great deal of dispute. You'll see here that they both closed churches and schools and theaters. Most of them didn't close businesses. Many of them did not close churches. Many of them did not close schools. They opted for staggered opening times for stores, and they did close theaters and cinemas, and they tended to get a lot of complaints about that forced some reopening. The solutions they had were very limited, but a big one was not to spread, and they knew it was airborne, not to spread the disease. And so they really actually had training posters on how to use your handkerchief. And this was really emphasized for men and boys. But bed rest, hand washing, wearing masks, but very useless, actually, gauze masks, because the virus was much smaller than a bacteria, and it got through, and they really were doing very little. But quarantines, closings, avoiding crowds, but the key was always nursing care. The problem is so many nurses had been sent overseas to care for the troops overseas, as had doctors, and also the American Red Cross that handled much of this did not accept African American nurses until very much at the end. What you'll see here, and what I'm going to show you from now on, is just simply some images to show you what was being done or tried to be done, and you'll see some very close similarities to today about making a mask, about disinfecting, and about washing your hands. And here are American Red Cross nurses making gauze masks. So these were very ineffective in many cases against the flu. You'll see a barber, street cleaner, and then probably my favorite cartoon of the time period, because I've been there where I've coughed and I thought, oh my God, everybody thinks I have COVID-19. And here are people going, who's sick down the end of the train. They didn't have Zoom, so they had open air meetings and court hearings in San Francisco. San Francisco tried to do a lot of things. You have a lot of people here, and this is just a partial list that I found of various people who got the flu, and some very seriously and recovered. A couple of them did not, and that affected the literature. If we go back to Professor Richard's presentation, President Woodrow Wilson apparently was affected psychologically, emotionally, in different ways. But we lost a lot of doctors, nurses, telephone switchboard operators, which is how you made a phone call, ambulance drivers, and grave diggers. And Philadelphia had to build a huge trench to bury some of the people, which might sound somewhat familiar to the Antonine Plague. But I thought people would enjoy this letter because this young girl, 16 years old, is talking about Norfolk is some dull now, because all the motion pictures and the theaters are closed. And she's not at work, and apparently her sister is not going to school because the schools are closed. So things are not that much different than they are now for many people. However, this is Brigham Young University. No social distancing that you can see here. I do know a school in Montana did have classes outside, so maybe others did. They worried about their sports being canceled, at least in Philadelphia, they did. They tried to figure out how to have sports with the infection out there. What does that all add up to? It was not a one-year flu. It was not the Spanish flu of 1918. It was the influenza of 1918, 1920, and even into 1921. The peak deaths, most American deaths occurred in a 10-week period. Began in Kansas, maybe. It was a blend of influenza and pneumonia that were the killers. It was global. India lost potentially, we're not sure, as many as 20 million people. It affected anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the world. It killed perhaps 100 million people. And what can we learn from this? Plan early and plan widely. Count on government, or hope you have government and health officials that you can believe, because if you don't, you're not going to trust them and you're not going to rely on their advice when the second wave or third wave arrives. It's up to individuals. Be aware that all of this is going to have an impact on individuals and how they respond to life, that it does affect certain groups more harshly, Alaskan Indigenous people, Native Americans in the United States, African Americans, the poor. And I will just kind of end with a paraphrase of what Dr. Anthony Fauci said 13 years ago: don't be complacent. And I will finally end with one of the few pieces of art. I have to do this for Professor Delancey and Professor Ock, one of the few pieces of art that grew out of this conflict. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to our host.
Well, thank you all so much for that really terrific presentation, Dr. Pitts, Dr. Howdelin, Dr. Farrell. Really wonderful presentation. So much there for us to uncover. Thanks to all the participants for the wonderful questions. We have a little bit of time now, for about 15 minutes for some of the questions. Let me start with Dr. Pitts and Dr. Howdelin. Thinking about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, today we understand epidemics due to viruses or bacterial organisms. How did they explain the occurrence of plagues, and were there common protocols for how they would respond in ancient times, either religious, political, leaving the city? What did they typically do, and were there some similarities there?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and there is a lot to unpack. I think that question alone could probably make a wonderful lecture. But I'll begin, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Professor Hotelin. The first thing that I want to mention is that Thucydides is very interesting in a number of ways. First of all, he is the first historical, he provides the first historical account of a disease in Greek literature that uses medicalized language. There are other stories, certainly from Greek myth and from Greek literature, about diseases. The beginning of Homer's Iliad, for example, begins with a plague in book 1. And in that particular description, the plague is clearly thought to be caused by a god, by the god Apollo. So I think that that question is really interesting, because the ancient Greeks, for example, did believe that there were religious or divine causes for plagues. The god Apollo was particularly associated with it. Now, one of the things that we know, for example, in 5th century Athens, when the Athenian plague struck, is that many Athenians did respond religiously. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Hotelin. One is that it is reported that the Athenians sent a delegation to purify the island of Delos, which was sacred to the god Apollo. They were, afraid that they had offended the god. And another example is that they built a shrine to Asclepius, the god of healing and Apollo's son, just at the base of the Athenian Acropolis. Professor Hotalin, do you want to add to that?
Well, the Romans were right in there with the Greeks in terms of assigning things to the gods, disease to the gods. And they were certainly no strangers at this point in the 2nd century AD in terms of what to do about it. Already back in the Republic, back 5th century BC, they actually introduced the cult of Apollo to Rome because they had a pestilence. An epidemic in Rome. And if you've ever wondered why you have various gods and goddesses that have different names in Greek mythology and religion than in Roman mythology and religion, but Apollo, it's the same name, it's because they didn't try to equate, the Romans didn't try to equate a Greek god, they just took the cult in wholesale. And then a couple of centuries later, they did the same thing with Asclepius. They couldn't quite pronounce it, so they called it Aesculapius, but they didn't change the name, they imported the god. So they were used to that. Now there was a full set then of healing gods, Apollo and his son Asclepius in Rome, and they did the usual things. Roman traditional state religion put up special offerings for the gods, and especially the gods of health, including Salus, the goddess of health. They did all of those things. And then in addition, and I think this speaks to the idea of thinking of the disease as something from the gods that was maybe even retribution for bad behavior. We have biographies for Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. The biographies are at least 130 years after they died, but they are still very telling in what they say about the plague. And they assign the idea of the Antonine Plague to retribution. There are a couple of stories. In one of the Roman soldiers, there he was in Babylon, the area where Seleucia, Mesopotamia was, and he went into a temple of Apollo and he opened a golden casket, and out came the disease. Of course, Apollo, god of healing, out comes the disease. Well, what was that Roman soldier doing in the temple, opening a golden casket that would have belonged to Apollo? See, this would be, retribution, like Pandora's box for doing something wrong. And also, the second explanation was that when that it started in Seleucia, so it started in that same area, because the Romans had made an agreement with Seleucia that they would not destroy the city, that they wouldn't, rip apart the city. They came to an agreement, and then the Romans did it anyway. They sacked the city. And so you see, this is what happens when you break an agreement. You have a plague that starts and spreads throughout the empire. So absolutely, that's where the Roman mindset was. They did understand contagion, however. They understood that it was a contagious disease. In fact, Galen, who was no one's fool, left Rome immediately after the plague began there. And he ended up being called back by the emperors because he was their personal physician. So he certainly got the point that it was contagious. And although they didn't completely understand the nature of how it was contagious, they knew that those who took care of sick people were going to get sick.
Thank you. I want to turn to Dr. Farrell now for a question that's sort of local. Those of you connected to the university know that UMW just released our Forward UMW plan for reopening. And the question is related to that, really. Can you say anything about how the local area, the Fredericksburg region, responded in 1918, and in particular, the Fredericksburg Teachers College?
know a lot about it, and it's not really covered in the Virginia newspapers. I did some digging because I figured that question would come up quite logically. There were cases, students at Mary Washington Teacher School did get the influenza, but none of them died. I did speak to our history department expert, Professor William Crawley, and because I got a chance to just talk to him, and he did confirm that there was one faculty member who died. I did some checking, though, more broadly to see what was going on in the state, and Richmond got hit pretty hard. Alexandria got hit pretty hard by this. The numbers are a little iffy, partly because people didn't know what they were always dealing with. And so that's one reason why the death range in the world could vary from 20 million to 100 million. You have cases that weren't diagnosed as the flu. You have cases that weren't diagnosed at all because people died away from anybody. You have a lot of lack of reporting, a lot of missing records or non-existent records to begin with. But I got curious in thinking about that, and I started digging around to find out what schools in general did. Many of the public schools stayed open in general because there were people who felt like maybe you close them in the rural areas, but you open them in the urban areas because that was probably a safer place to be than many other places that children could be, and they would get attention. There were numerous cases of visiting nurses going into homes and finding perhaps both parents dead and young children starving because there was nobody there to help. So there was a lot of checking, but I did do some checking in a fair number of schools. What they did is they closed for about 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And they often quarantined, isolated their students to keep them safe, and then cared for the ones that were sick. And in my sense is that's what happened at Mary Washington. There were a couple of schools where 7, 8 people died. Strikingly, the president of the University of North Carolina died. He and his wife were taking care of students, and he got the flu and he died. And he was a whopping 42, I believe. So he was very much in that age where they were not supposed to.
Now, another element of all of the presentations today ties to how plagues have been named. And so when we look at any of them, any of the pandemics, there's a name associated with it. In almost any instance we've talked about, or you all have talked about, and we've looked at examples about how there's slightly changes in names and the way it's named. And if we look at the way the 1918 flu was called the Spanish influenza, and starting with you, Dr. Farrell, was there then blame upon Spain for causing that? And how does that relate to the way some might call COVID a Chinese virus? And certainly that's very controversial. But are there similarities historically with the way the naming of the pandemic has played into political or social motivations?
I haven't picked up anything that really blamed the Spanish. It was just, here's a label to put on it. I believe, that certain countries blamed Russia, like I said, they blamed China. And I have run into things that say, people have a tendency to want to blame outsiders. And I have run into it in earlier epidemics in the United States where it was retribution from God, some of that similar ideas that Professor Hotelin talked about, but I haven't picked up any of that. And because of the global war, it was impossible to really blame anybody and respond with repercussions on trade or anything like that. The war kind of took priority over everything, and maritime trade just continued. There were some efforts. One striking example, I'll just throw this in because it was so striking to me. Part of Samoa was controlled by New Zealand and part American Samoa, obviously by the United States. American Samoa's governor immediately put barriers to stop ships from coming in. Not a single person died. With about the same population in the rest of Samoa, I can't remember the numbers. I think I have it down here. About 1/5 of the population died. So there was a noticeable difference, but it was very, very difficult to stop that trade. So I think that kind of overwhelmed any emphasis on putting blame anywhere.
Thank you. We're sort of at the end of our time here, but I did want to turn to the ancient historians for one final thought from them, and that really is about the economic impact. We're seeing quite an economic impact now, and it's unclear how long this is going to last and how the United States is going to recover. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the similar kinds of questions in the ancient times, what the impact was, how long it lasted, how did they recover, those sorts of things. Start with Dr. Pitts, maybe.
Okay, I will speak pretty briefly about that. That's another really, really important question and an interesting one. I will say that it's really difficult to disaggregate the effects of war from the effects of the disease. But I think that one of the things that Thucydides attempts to communicate to his audience, and again, Thucydides is our most important source because he describes the disease and its effects in ways that other sources don't. But he states that Athens didn't recover in terms of its human population, its work population, its military population sufficiently until about 15 years later. And at that time, Athens launched a very ambitious expedition against Sicily, where they were possibly struck by the same plague again. And the consequences of it were felt profoundly. In 404 BCE, Athens lost the war to Sparta. It lost its empire, it lost its commanding navy, and the Athens that we saw in the 5th century prior to the epidemic never really fully recovered. Professor Hotelin?
Well, I did address this a little bit, a little tantalizing bit, I think. The thing about the Roman Empire is it was huge, really huge. So this is a rich area of research for historians right now, to try and go through inscriptions, in the case of Egypt, papyri, remains of buildings, and look for dates and try and figure out, well, what was the building industry like? What was the marble industry like? What was the brick industry like? And was there a lessening and diminishing of it during the plague and after? And as you can imagine, this is ongoing work. It's exciting work, but it looks to me as though the recovery was there within 3 decades after the plague. As I said, really, the plague did certainly affect economy and the joys of life, but the Roman Empire could have recovered. It's just that there were other problems coming in. And we're better at manipulating the economy today. And so as long as we are alert and work on it and end the COVID-19 situation as rapidly as possible, not just with a vaccine, but with global cooperation for getting it out there, I think we have every chance of a healthy recovery much, much more quickly.
Well, thank you again to all of the presenters. Really a wonderful session. Learned a lot, so much great content here that we could probably spend an entire semester on just the topics that were highlighted here. But thank you again for that. Luckily, during this discussion, our university librarian, Rosemary Arneson, added something in the chat that I'd love to share with you all. She noted that Simpson Library here at UMW has a letter that then Mary Washington, the normal school president Russell, sent to the board related to the school's response to the 1918 flu. And he reported in that letter that more than half of the faculty and some 200 students had the flu at that time. So it was certainly something that had a great impact on our campus, as this pandemic is having an impact on our campus as well. So thanks again to the presenters. I had a couple of quick announcements for the students that are taking the course, and a number of them have reached out asking for information about that final paper assignment. Dr. Mellinger will be sending that out later tonight. He does have the full assignment ready. He wanted to include some other details so that you have everything you need to work on that paper. Look for an email from him later tonight with that information. Also, to remind you that we have another excellent presentation coming up on Wednesday. It's titled COVID-19, the Curve, the Numbers, and the Markets, with faculty from mathematics and also a guest from our College of Business in Finance. And we'll be back at 4 o'clock on Wednesday for that session, and we'll be ready for the next couple of weeks. We have just a few more presentations coming up to round out this course. Hopefully you've been enjoying it as much as we have. Thanks again to the presenters, thanks to the participants, and we'll see you all on Wednesday.